The concept of an eye for an eye presented itself in the film when people used the saying during protests for Poncelet's execution. The saying originated from ancient Mesopotamian culture and was a paraphrase from the 282 laws written by the Babylonian king Hammurabi. Hammurabi's laws were not based on revenge, but focused more on proportional justice for those who deserved it. It was a harsh code. For example, if a doctor accidentally killed a patient, his hands would be cut off, or if a citizen were to come forth claiming a murder had occurred, but was unable to prove it, they would be sentenced to death. This saying was later adapted by European society and later by Western society too. Christianity is a huge part in the film. In the book of Matthew, Jesus said, "He who lives by the sword dies by the sword." This quote supports the principle of an eye for an eye because it is illustrating that a person who uses violence can expect to suffer violence themselves. However, even though Sister Helen is Christian, she does not agree with the saying, as she states the Bible also says things like adultery and prostitution are punishable by death. The death penalty has primarily been used to purge a community of a certain type of person, whether that was from the bias of those in power or to punish a large group of people deemed bad. Throughout history, it has also been used to eliminate traitors, such as people accused of using witchcraft. This was seen during the Salem witch trials in Massachusetts, which lasted through 1692 to 1693. Today, people believe in the death penalty because it arguably deters people from committing certain crimes. However, there is no actual evidence that the death penalty is a better deterrent than alternative punishments. Philosophy professor Thaddeus Metz wrote in his essay, African Values in Capital Punishment, that for decades, criminologists were unable to find real evidence that the death penalty deters more than, say, life in prison. During the Middle Ages, England did not have a police or prison system like they do today, so the death sentence was commonly used. Methods during this time included boiling, burning at the stake, drawing and quartering, and hanging. Sometimes hundreds of people would show up to watch a hanging. The death penalty was also used in America, primarily in the 1600s and 1700s, where they put certain laws in place, including the use of the death penalty. They used hanging as the primary way of execution as it was seen as the most humane. However, it was also done in public so people could watch. In 1789, Congress passed the Eighth Amendment prohibiting cruel and unusual punishments, which impacted death row. The death sentence has been the topic of many controversies throughout the years, as people argued it went against the 8th and 14th Amendments. Two examples of this were court cases Furman v. Georgia and Gregg v. Georgia. Furman v. Georgia happened in 1972. Furman was burglarizing a home when the residents discovered him. He attempted to flee, but his gun went off and ended up killing one of the residents. Because of this, he was convicted of murder and sentenced to death. The question in this case was whether the imposition and carrying out of the death penalty constitute cruel and unusual punishment in violation of the 8th and 14th Amendments. The court ended up ruling that the imposition of the death penalty in these types of cases did in fact violate the Constitution. In the case of Gregg v. Georgia, which happened in 1976, Gregg was found guilty of armed robbery and murder and was sentenced to death. He challenged the sentence by claiming the punishment violated the 8th and 14th Amendments. The court ruled that the punishment did not violate these amendments because Gregg had deliberately killed another person, which was considered an extreme criminal case. The difference between these two is that in Furman v. Georgia, Furman unintentionally had killed one of the residents, while Gregg had intentionally killed another person. Another notable case was Woodson v. North Carolina, which was also in 1972. North Carolina had enacted legislation that made the death penalty a mandatory punishment for all first-degree murders, which are murders that are willful and premeditated. When Woodson was found guilty of this offense, he was automatically sentenced to death. Woodson challenged this sentence, saying that a mandatory death sentence violated the 8th and 14th Amendments. The court ultimately sided with Woodson and ruled that the North Carolina law was unconstitutional.
In Dead Man Walking, the movie shows the controversial ethical issues with the death penalty from all sides. The audience views capital punishment from the viewpoint of the inmate on death row, Matthew Poncelet, who states he is innocent. In the beginning, Poncelet is depicted as stubborn, a racist, and unremorseful of his actions. This allows viewers to separate themselves from him and to not view him as a perfect man. Regardless, the audience feels sympathy towards Poncelet as we believe he has been wrongfully convicted. Throughout the movie, we find out that Poncelet had a rough childhood and lived in poverty his whole life. During his parole board meeting, Poncelet's lawyer, Hilton Barber, states that you're not going to find many rich people on death row. Matthew Poncelet is here today because he is poor. We learned that his original lawyer was not experienced with capital cases and only raised one objection the entire trial. However, Poncelet's accomplice, Carl, had the means to pay for a lawyer. As a result, he was given life imprisonment and not the death penalty. Throughout Poncelet's journey with Sister Helen, he slowly starts to change. In the days leading up to his execution, he becomes more self-reflective. Prior to his execution, he has a change of heart and tells Sister Helen that he was guilty of the crimes he was charged with. As Poncelet is tied to the gurney, he apologizes to the families of the victims and is remorseful for his actions. He asks for forgiveness from the families and admits that killing is wrong. This change of heart and character development leads the audience feeling sympathetic towards both parties. Sister Helen is a devout nun dedicated to helping the poor. She starts corresponding with Poncelet, an inmate on death row. She agrees to help him get his sentence commuted to life imprisonment. Sister Helen's controversial position leads to her community and others questioning her. For example, her family questions why she's wasting her time with someone like Poncelet when she could be using her energy helping someone who deserves it. Sister Helen maintains her stance that she is following the teachings of Jesus Christ. Regardless of Poncelet's demeanor and the crimes he's accused of, she views him as one of God's children who need salvation. During the pardon board meeting, she first meets the parents of Walter and Hope. They confront her and are unhappy that she's defending someone like Poncelet and how she did not meet with them. Sister Helen eventually meets up with the parents of the victims and hears their side of the story. Although she feels greatly for the victims and their families, Sister Helen states that she is on no one's side. She does not think what Poncelet did is right, but does not believe in the death penalty. She states, "What he was involved with was evil. I don't condone it. I just don't see the sense of killing people to say killing people is wrong." She stays with Poncelet as a spiritual advisor until his execution. Capital punishment is used in both a political and personal manner throughout the movie. For example, the day before the governor is going to run for re-election, he sets a date for Matthew Poncelet's execution to show how tough he is on crime. When the lawyer of the victim states to the parole board, "All the families ask of you is simple justice for their unbearable loss," the board ultimately declines clemency for Matthew. After the execution of 2 black inmates, Poncelet states that the governor is under pressure to execute a white person. He will be executed in 1 week under the new execution procedure, the lethal injection machine. The parents of the victims see Poncelet's execution as a means of liberating themselves from their suffering. Prior to Poncelet's death, he states that he hopes him dying will give the families some peace.
The topic of an innocent life being put to death is discussed by many of Poncelet's allies, but was not frequently mentioned by the opposing side. This is because many characters were certain that Poncelet had actively taken part in the murder of the 2 teens. His opposers were portrayed as stubborn individuals, driven by their wishes to see him killed. However, had Poncelet been innocent, his execution would have been highly unjust. This is the viewpoint the audience is presented with for the majority of the movie, encouraging more sympathetic viewers to take his side. Additionally, many pro-death penalty protesters spoke of Poncelet's death as proportional punishment for what he did to Hope Percy and Walter Delacroix. They seemed unbothered by how he would be put to death because they wanted to see him suffer the way his victims suffered. However, during the appeals hearing, Poncelet's lawyer discussed the ethics of lethal injection, which is the current method of execution. He details how the injection is administered and goes on to explain how the first shot's purpose is to relax the body and hide the inmate's physical reaction from the onlookers. This tactic was used by him to ensure that the court understood exactly what was going to happen if his client was put to death. Nathanson writes how the saying, "an eye for an eye," is not a valid method of doling out punishments. In the context of Dead Man Walking, many antagonists of Poncelet wanted to see him dead. For example, during one of their protests, an individual shouted at Sister Helen, "an eye for an eye." Following Nathanson's argument of the phrase, would this individual agree with raping rapists and torturing torturers as well? It was established by the end of the movie that Poncelet actually did rape Hope Percy and shot Walter Delacroix. If that same protester got word of this information, would they push harder for a harsher sentence than lethal injection? It is unclear where the pro-death penalty supporters would draw the line when it came to capital punishment. Of course, the real limitation is the law, but consider as well that the human conscience is also a limitation. To follow are two ethical concepts for equal punishment. Proportional retributivism would encourage the court to punish Poncelet and Vitello differently, since the former was intimidated by Vitello and pressured to follow along. Alternatively, payback retributivism would encourage similar punishments for both men, since each of them raped Hope Percy and killed one teen. In states that have legalized the death penalty, it is up to a judge and jury to ultimately decide whether or not a certain individual will get life in prison or a seat on death row. While both deciding parties must be as objective as possible, it is highly likely that each individual's subjective beliefs will influence their decision. Additionally, they would be protected in the case of the inmate put to death turned out to be innocent. This begs the question of how ethical the death penalty is when there are potentially innocent lives at stake. Additionally, the topic of medically induced death is a controversial topic in and of itself. Currently, physician-assisted suicide is not legal in many states. The argument presented is that it is against a doctor's moral code to take a life when their job is to save one. Since the institution of the Eighth Amendment, it has become unlawful to treat prison inmates in cruel and unusual ways. So, while the death penalty is legal in some states, the ethics of holding an inmate on death row have been up for debate. When Sister Helen first visited Poncelet, he had been kept in solitary confinement, since that was the requirement for inmates waiting for their execution. However, he had been there for 6 years. It is unconstitutional to keep an inmate on death row for an extended amount of time. However, holding times remain at an all-time high. According to the Death Penalty Information Center, some prisoners have been on death row for well over 20 years. This begs the question, is an inmate's wait on death row included in their sentence? And if so, wouldn't waiting decades for inevitable death be considered cruel and unusual punishment? This leads back to the issue of subjectivity when it comes to death sentences and laws surrounding capital punishment. While the sentence is harsh and final, there are not many stipulations as to how long a given inmate must wait in prison and how they will be treated when they are in there.